Good afternoon. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the Committee on June 16, 2016, the Committee will resume its study on immigration measures for the protection of vulnerable groups. Appearing before us for this third panel of the day is Mr. Aneki Nissan, the President of the Centre for Canadian-Assyrian Relations, Mr. David Marshall, who's the team leader assessment mission to South Sudan for the UNHCR. And also joining us from Samaritan's Purse, Canada, Mr. John Clayton, Director of Programs and Projects, and Ms. Raja Lisa Schmidt-Sagan, who's appearing by video conference from Duhok in Iraq. Welcome to everyone, and we'll begin with Mr. Nissan. 7 minutes, please.
Good afternoon, honorable members and guests. My name is Aneki Nissan, and I'm the president of the Centre for Canadian-Assyrian Relations. I've come here today to discuss the fate of the Assyrian community in Iraq and Syria. The Assyrians are a transnational, ethnic community that belong to a number of Christian churches in the Middle East and are indigenous to the region. Since the fall of Mosul and the Nineveh Plains to ISIS, in the summer of 2014, Assyrians have faced mass exodus from their centuries-old historical homes. They have been living as internally displaced refugees in northern Iraq in abhorrent conditions and have been marginalized in the political and social life of Iraq. As a result of this conundrum, others have fled the country and are now living in neighboring states as they seek asylum from various governments around the world. Those from Syria have faced larger threats of mass extermination at the hands of both government and opposition forces, and most prominently Assyrian-dominated towns and villages around the Khabur River were attacked and invaded by ISIS on February 23, 2015. Hundreds of community members were taken hostage and imprisoned by ISIS. The city of Qamishli, which was built by those fleeing the 1915 Ottoman genocide, has also been targeted repeatedly by ISIS, and most memorably during the 2015-16 Christmas season, where an explosion targeting those celebrating the season came to kill Assyrians and destroy several Assyrian-owned businesses within the city. Even as recently as June 21st of this year, the Syriac Orthodox Patriarch came under attack as he was praying for the victims of the 1915 genocide, alongside priests and bishops from other Assyrian denominations. This is all part of a systemic and targeted assault on members of the Assyrian community in Syria by ISIS and other forces since the outbreak of war in 2011. As members of the Canadian diaspora, we are urging the Canadian government and Canadian Parliament to help our community in both Iraq and Syria. We have a three-pronged approach to help our community alongside other minorities like the Yazidis, the Shebek, and others. Number one, we are asking the Canadian government to expedite the processing of asylum applications from members of the community alongside members of the aforementioned communities. This will help those living in limbo and begin the process to help members of the community gain a new life in Canada, where a substantial community already exists. Some of the first Assyrian settlers to Canada arrived in the late 1800s, and many helped settle North Battleford, Saskatchewan in 1903. Today, for example, in the Toronto-Windsor corridor, Assyrians have no less than 20 churches in the area where members are all willing to help welcome refugees and help in the process of integrating new arrivals in Canadian life. Additionally, many of those seeking asylum in Canada are arriving with educations and professional backgrounds that would allow them to become productive citizens. Number two, we are hoping that in addition to the help provided to refugees, the Canadian government, alongside its allies, can find a sustainable solution for those people on the ground in Iraq and Syria. Assyrians, Yazidis, Shebeks, and others have come under the help of oppressive regimes, and they are living at the mercy of people who are unable or unwilling to help protect members of their community. We hope that the Canadian government can help in providing humanitarian aid to those stuck living away from their homes in Iraq and Syria. Canadian government and Canadian aid agencies can help by working directly with Assyrian aid organizations on the ground, who have a deeper understanding of the issues that are currently facing the refugees as they seek to find a more permanent solution on the ground. Third, finally, Assyrians have been disarmed by Kurdish and Iraqi troops. This left their villages vulnerable, which allowed ISIS to invade their territory unopposed. We are hoping that the Canadian government, in its current mission against ISIS, can help fund, arm, and train the Nineveh Plains Protection Unit as they systematically work to liberate their villages from the grips of ISIS. I sincerely thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Nissan. We'll now hear from Mr. Marshall. Mr. Marshall has indicated that he would take 5 minutes at this time, and due to the nature of his presentation at the end of this particular hearing, we will move in camera for approximately 10 minutes to allow additional information to be presented at that time. So, Mr. Marshall, 5 minutes.
Very much to you and to your colleagues for reaching out to the United Nations for this briefing on the human rights situation in South Sudan. The world's newest nation, tragically, a country some 5.5 years old, has had 2.5 years of war, in which more than 1.5 million people have been internally displaced and forced into harsh and dangerous living conditions. Thousands more have sought safety and shelter from their own government and opposition forces, finding refuge within UN compounds. The crisis in South Sudan is profound. A political crisis has led to a human rights crisis, and the consequences have also resulted in a humanitarian, economic, and security crisis. As you know, the conflict broke out in Juba, the capital, in December 2013, and through much of 2014, the UN and the African Union have documented brutal violations and abuses of human rights committed by both sides, the government and the opposition with allied militia, that the UN and the AU said in 2014 amounted to crimes against humanity and war crimes. In 2015, the Human Rights Council of the UN asked my office to undertake an assessment mission that I led to identify human rights violations committed in the country since December 2013. The report, which we issued in March of this year, concluded that in 2015, the government's counterinsurgency offensive in Unity State was carried out with the apparent purpose of spreading terror among civilians, including widespread sexual and gender-based violence, which led to the abduction of women and girls and indiscriminate attacks on villages, some of which involved massive looting of property and the theft of thousands upon thousands of cattle. Throughout this conflict, sexual and gender-based violence has been widespread. We documented in 2015 that the breadth and depth of the crimes against women and girls was alarming. We concluded that rape and sexual violence were being used as a weapon of war. The consequences of this violence upon the civilian population are grave and profound. We concluded in 2015 that, yes, yet again, remarkably, crimes against humanity and war crimes had taken place in South Sudan. As you may know, in international law, there are 3 atrocity crimes. The only one we haven't mentioned is genocide. And we didn't mention genocide because although we think the actus reus of genocide had taken place, there was insufficiency of evidence to conclude that the mens rea of genocide had happened. Nevertheless, we've concluded that 2 of the 3 atrocity crimes in international law have taken place. Thousands have been killed, many brutally. We documented children who were killed by being hung from trees. The campaign of sexual violence shocks the conscience. No one is spared, not children, not the elderly, not the disabled. One witness, a mother, described to us being tied to a tree as soldiers raped her, gang raped her daughter, and then shot her husband dead. The humanitarian crisis is 6 million, which is half the population, are in need of humanitarian assistance, almost 3 million of which are severely food insecure. Many parts of the country face severe food insecurity and possible famine. We discovered that civilians were forced into the wetlands eating grass and turmeric. The IDP population is around 1.8 million. Around 200,000 of those are seeking the protection of within the UN compounds, of which there are 6. The refugee population as of 15th of June, according to UNHCR, is 871,536. 70% of that refugee population are children. There's been massive destruction of civilian property. UN premises, schools, churches have all been attacked. Killings have taken place in churches and mosques. Killings have also taken place in UN bases. Humanitarians killed to date are 49, including UN staff who are disappeared and presumed dead, working with the World Food Programme. The economic crisis today is inflation is at 300%. The value of the local pound has dropped 90%. And the security crisis is also deeply troubling. The national security apparatus in South Sudan, so parking for 1 minute the conflict-related violence, the national security apparatus is everywhere in South Sudan, harassing, detaining, killing opponents. The democratic space is being suffocated with civil society under constant surveillance and humanitarian staff under constant threat. The additional challenges I would urge you to consider for vulnerable groups are just the sheer size of the country. I mean, it is France meets Belgium, one state, Jonglei. There are 10 states, is the size of Bangladesh. There's almost no paved roads. Much of the frightened population who are on the run are in hard-to-reach areas. The rainy season limits our movement, which is April through December. The malaria is rampant, including cerebral malaria, which has killed thousands, including UN staff. And the conflict has given rise to a new type of IDP settlement, which is those living within UN compounds. Those compounds were never intended to protect South Sudanese civilians from their own government. 2 days ago, we were informed by the government that the rotary wing aircraft of the UN would not be allowed to fly in the country. And also, we could not provide new UN staff to South Sudan. And our national staff are not allowed to leave the country. The Council of Elders, who are Dinka who support the government, have informed the UN that the idea of sending additional international troops, which, as you may have heard yesterday, is the idea of the African Union, would be a declaration of war and an invasion of the country. Despite these challenges, the UN and its partners in 2015 has provided assistance to 4.5 million people. In 2016, 1 million have been reached. But there is a critical lack of funding. As of the 12th of July, only 40% of the 1.3 billion humanitarian response plan for 2016 has been provided. On the topic of refugees, according to UNHCR, only 17% of the $573 million for refugee protection has been provided. And as you know, new fighting has broken out in February in Pibor in Jonglei State, and also, as you know, recently in Juba 10 days ago. In terms of what should happen next and what can Canada possibly do, I set out some recommendations in the brief note to you about the need for robust diplomacy. The crisis, as I said at the outset, is deep and profound and growing. Canada has imposed sanctions, asset freezes and financial sanctions against 2 persons, I believe, in 2014. There's a question that the UN has raised with member states, including Canada, as to whether or not there should be an arms embargo. There is no arms embargo against South Sudan. I would also ask Canada to consider providing military and police personnel to the UN mission, as well as adequate funding for the UN humanitarian response plan and also for UNHCR's refugee protection and assistance programs, as well as supporting civil society coalitions that are working for reconciliation. But the most obvious solution for protecting vulnerable people is a political transformation to end the orchestration of the violence, predominantly by the political elite of the country. In closing this part of my statement, I would say that the crisis in South Sudan is deep, profound, and almost existential. The international rhetoric of no more Rwandas appears empty. The government has no regard for life. You're either a loyalist or you're not. And if you're not, you're in peril of harassment, detention, and death. What's particularly distressing, I think, for us...
Thank you, Mr. Marshall. Perhaps we can expand on your opening statement during the rounds of questioning.
So shall I close? Would you like me to end?
Yes, please.
I'd be happy to do so.
Mr. Clayton and Ms. Schmidt-Tagan, 7 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Honourable Chair and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak and hopefully contribute to resolving the difficult questions before you all. My colleague Raya Lisa and I will be sharing our allotted time. There are 2 questions we will address. First, are some refugee groups more vulnerable than others? We would like to offer testimony and evidence to this question. Secondly, how should Canada respond? We have distributed a brief which details 4 recommendations, and I'd like to turn it over to Raya to continue.
Greetings from Iraq. Over the last year, I have been serving as the director of a community center, providing services to a population of over 40,000 displaced Yazidis. While it has been mentioned many times already, the horror of the Yazidis have experienced is ongoing, and we must acknowledge that thousands of Yazidi women, children, and youth remain in the clutches of ISIS today. I have worked for NGOs internationally for over 15 years in countries like Afghanistan, Haiti, Pakistan, and I thought I had seen the worst of humanity. But then I moved to northern Iraq, and I heard firsthand the accounts of what these Yazidis have had to endure at the hands of ISIS. I have seen no other minority group in Iraq who has had to endure the evil that ISIS has perpetuated against the Yazidi population. Please understand, we do not want to minimize in any way the ISIS horrors inflicted on these other minority groups. 718 days ago, on August 3rd, 2014, entire Yazidi people group became the focus of an ongoing ISIS genocidal intent, as clearly documented in the UN Human Rights Council report released on June 15, 2016. This is now formally recognized by the UN and the Government of Canada as genocide. They have been singled out because of their religious narrative and perceived lifestyle. Throughout Iraq, Yazidis have been stigmatized as subhuman, dirty, and devil worshippers. I sat down with my Yazidi staff and talked with them about what they have faced and why they wanted to leave Iraq. This is what they told us. We have been attacked and targeted by Muslims because they think we do not believe in God. The future looks bad for us as Yazidis, and we are worried about our children. We think that our children could be killed and targeted by Muslims in the future. We would prefer to leave rather than go back to Sinjar. No one protected us there. We have lost trust for everyone. Neither the Peshmerga or the Iraqi army protected us. They handed us over to ISIS. We lived close to Arab Muslims, and when we were attacked, we were abandoned by them as well. Abandoned by our neighbors who we have known and welcomed into our homes. These people helped ISIS to attack us and our girls. After what happened on Sinjar, we no longer trust Muslims, especially because of what happened to our girls, who have been taken, held captive, raped, and sometimes killed. End of quote. Yazidis are victims of genocide, the most heinous crime of our modern era. However, trying to leave has held its own challenges. Most Yazidis are internally displaced and therefore not considered refugees. Most Yazidis do not have proper identification. The Kurdish government will not issue identification because Yazidis from Sinjar are from regions of Iraq that are controlled by the central government. This means a very costly and dangerous trip to Baghdad to get passport and documents. Many of them, certainly the ones in my community, are not wealthy and do not have the resources to go to another country. Some have scraped together the money needed to be smuggled out of the country, but many are not willing to risk this. One of our staff's extended family lost 11 people in the Aegean Sea when they attempted to cross. This leaves them in a vulnerable position, remaining in camps and temporary shelters at the mercy of a region that wants them to leave. Yazidis understand that they exist in a surrounding culture and context that views them with contempt. They do not expect to receive fair treatment in systems that we would expect would serve them. All these challenges leave them feeling trapped. If Canada is going to seek to offer services to them, it is important to understand this context and ensure that those who engage with them are aware of this history and these biases. The Yazidis need Canada's assistance and intervention. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll begin the round of questioning. Oh.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, we just,
Yes.
I was going to continue on.
Okay, Mr. Clayton, please.
Like my colleague, I have extensive experience working internationally in many of the worst places in this world, and I'm highly honored to speak on behalf of the Yazidi people and other minority groups because I visited there 3 times and because I know what I've seen and observed. I'd like to clarify that we don't represent a sponsorship interest in this, although we're sympathetic to the situation that they face and want to speak on behalf of what we've seen on the ground. We're responders, not involved in this end of the equation. As a Christian organization, Samaritan's Purse Mandate recognizes the universally accepted humanitarian principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. These principles are central to Canadian foreign policy and all international humanitarian action. I disagree with some of what I've heard in previous testimony regarding these principles. Humanitarian principles of humanity and impartiality, by definition, recognize that there are priorities of need which must be directed to those most vulnerable and most affected. Yes, there should be no discrimination in applying these principles, no favoritism or no partiality shown. However, once a vulnerability is deemed to be genocide, the discrimination argument disappears because genocide is the worst. It's recognized that way. On the worldwide spectrum of refugee vulnerability, we see plenty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. That's widespread. Even these terms themselves imply a scale or a degree of criminality. What we've personally observed and what is unique with the Yazidis is this term genocide. Arguably, this merits the Government of Canada's highest priority on all levels, including immigration. Yes, some refugee groups are more vulnerable than others. This is irrefutable when there is genocide. How should Canada respond? Our brief that we've provided outlines 4 recommendations in detail, but in summary, we recommend that the government accelerate and prioritize Yazidi refugee process, including the internally displaced. Secondly, we recommend that Canada prepare specifically designed support for Yazidi refugees who have experienced a variety of genocide traumas and will need special care when they arrive here in Canada. We recommend that Yazidi refugees who have left Syria and Iraq yet remain in the region in places like Turkey be identified as the most vulnerable and be the first priority. Lastly, we recommend that the recommendations contained in the United Nations Human Rights Council report on Yazidi genocide be enacted by the entire government of Canada. It speaks to many other aspects other than immigration. I'd like to thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Clayton.
Welcome questions.
Mr. Tabara, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here, and thank you for the work that you're doing and raising awareness of each region in the world, and I really want to thank you for all of that. My first question was to Mr. Marshall. According to the UN report that you've worked on and that was recently published, violations perpetrated in South Sudan may amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. It includes killing and other attacks against civilians, rape, and other acts of sexual violence, violations of child rights, including recruitment and the use in hostilities. You mentioned in your testimony some of the crimes and crimes against humanity that you mentioned, but in this article here, I'm just going to mention, and you can reiterate to this too. You can that. It's between April to September 2015, the UN recorded more than 1,300 reports of rape in just one state in South Sudan. Also, in this report here, it says that crimes against humanity, there's such incidents as children and disabled killed or being burned alive, suffocated in containers, shot and hanged from trees and cut into pieces. This is very, very disturbing news, and I know it should be getting more attention probably in the media. But my question here is that the report mentions in particular that sexual and gender-based violence has been widespread, and you mentioned a little bit in your testimony. Can you elaborate more on that?
I mean, from December 2013 up until today, it has been used as a weapon of war, we allege, the UN alleges, predominantly by the government forces and associated militia. And I think what was so striking for us in our most recent investigation is the impact that has had on, like, the social fabric. When you meet, particularly, I mean, many of the men are dead in families, and the households are led by women, and the stories they tell over 2.5 years of kidnapping of their children. We're talking about girls who are kidnapped, taken to bases, government militia bases, and used as sex slaves, and sometimes shot dead, sometimes released. 2.5 years and no one's preventing this, no one's stopping this. The government has said publicly that it will do its best to prevent sexual violence, but it hasn't happened. I think, so as I said, what was so striking for us is the damage it's actually now doing to the communities. These communities are suffering enormously over this campaign of killing and sexual violence and disappearances, in addition to everything else, destroying their houses, stealing their cattle, stealing their food. It's, as I said in my statement, it's this existential crisis, because you may know that we have 10,500 troops in South Sudan who've been there since 2013, and we don't have enough troops to protect women and girls.
Following clashes in Juba a few days ago, thousands of Sudanese have been displaced, and you've mentioned many numbers in your testimony. We've read that there are cholera outbreaks in local camps, that even civilians and staff in UN camps get caught up in the fighting. With only 17% of the UN appeal for South Sudan being raised so far, and humanitarian responses sorely lacking due to severe underfunding, what are the prospects of the displaced people in the country?
I think it's grim. I think today it's grim. I heard before I came here from a colleague in DPKO, the Department of Peacekeeping, that the World Food Program had said it had lost millions of dollars of food that had been stolen. So the UN prepositions food for the rainy season, which has just started, all that for civilians, and all that food has been stolen by government soldiers. A few days ago. So the prospects are grim. The UN sites aren't intended to protect civilians on this scale, but we had, I think, 13,000 plus civilians that came to our site 10 days ago in Juba alone. And we're worried about government rhetoric that you may have heard in the news, which is that they believe opposition figures are in these sites, or in UN sites, and I think we're fearful that these sites may be raided. These UN sites may be raided by soldiers, government soldiers.
We've been talking in this committee a lot about how to get to IDPs and how to reach them in the countries where they're displaced. In South Sudan, if that was the case, you mentioned that there was 49 humanitarians killed. If there was such a program that countries were to try to get IDPs from a conflict zone, would that raise a lot of security concerns, as you mentioned in South Sudan?
Yeah, I'm sure John could speak to that as well. I mean, humanitarians have been murdered. They've been beaten. When I was there from October through January of this year, humanitarian offices in Juba were raided by the national security apparatus. Staff were beaten, cars stolen, money stolen, food stolen. Movement is restricted. We, the UN, which have a Security Council mandate, a robust mandate to protect civilians, are prevented from using our helicopters and planes to fly around the country with our troops. The government prevents that from happening. Or I should say, we have to seek clearance first, and we never get clearance to move our aircraft, our food, and our armed peacekeepers. So the conditions, I think, that we're working in South Sudan are extreme, and I think that's the solution, frankly, is through the Security Council. That's the only solution, and the African Union, I would suggest, to see some movement in this government. But the government seems to be not interested with cooperating with either us or the African Union.
So even local police forces would be unable to provide safety for any humanitarian?
So I would suggest, I mean, our reporting suggests that the local police force had been involved in the atrocities, the killing of civilians and the rape of women and girls, so we wouldn't trust the local police authorities.
Mm-hmm. 30 seconds, I guess.
Thank you. Ms. Rimpel?
Thank you. Mr. Clayton, my understanding is you were sitting in the panel, you listened to the panel prior to this, so you would have heard the recommendations that I read out that we're considering as part of the committee. Yes?
Yes, that's correct.
Do you support those recommendations?
Yeah, I support those recommendations, and I would just add, I do think that, as I mentioned in the fourth recommendation that we've contributed, is that there is a need for a whole of government approach to this, because this does exceed the mandate of or issues regarding immigration or refugee or asylum. There is calls in those recommendations from the United Nations to fund the support and the possible return of Yazidis into the areas they've been displaced out of. So I think there's those issues. I think also as a Canadian citizen, to realize that I may have the numbers incorrect, but I believe there are 60 individuals here in Canada that have served with ISIS. Do we have war crimes perpetrators, do we have genocide perpetrators in our midst here in Canada? To look at the full implications of what this thing really looks like. So I would just encourage a whole of government approach to the recommendations that have been made, and our recommendations really are built upon what those that UN document specifies. Thanks.
Mr. Nissan,